always with truth as our guide. With clarity on the mic, bringing light to the fight. Together we're ready, shining bright. Behind the agenda, plans in our hands. Exploring the progress where every voice stands. From the ground impact to the oil and gas scene. Together we'll build a future strong and keen. We'll dive into the data, the numbers don't lie. Examining the challenges, reaching for the sky. Education, infrastructure, let's pave the way. With fiscal responsibility, we'll seize the day. Behind the agenda, plans in our hands. Exploring the progress where every voice stands. From the ground impact to the oil and gas scene. Together we'll build a future strong and keen. Whoa, tune in every Wednesday, feel the vibe. For the stories and insights that we all prescribe. Plans, policies and progress we'll uncover. With every discussion, let's support one another. Behind the agenda, plans in our hands. Exploring the progress where every voice stands. From the ground impact to the oil and gas scene. Together we'll build a future strong and keen. Don't dive into deep, don't get keen. We'll dive into the data, the numbers don't lie. Examining the challenges, reaching for the sky. Education, infrastructure, let's pave the way. With fiscal responsibility, we'll seize the day. Behind the agenda, plans in our hands. Plans in our hands. Progress where every voice stands. In the progress, from the ground impact to the oil and gas scene. Oil and gas scene. Together we'll build a future strong and keen. Strong and keen. Tune in every Wednesday. Feel the vitality. Stories and insights that we all prescribe. Plans, policies and progress. Time to end the discussion. Let's support one another. In the heart of our nation, where voice.
Good evening, and welcome to another episode of Behind the Agenda Plans, Policies, and Progress. I'm your host, Cordell Jones, and tonight we're diving deep beyond the headlines, beyond the political posturing, and into the core of the issues that matter. Last week, we touched briefly on the Bank of Guyana's US 135 million injection into the Forex market. Since then, the letters have poured in, some saying it's routine, others call it a red flag. But here's the thing, we need to unpack the full picture. What does this injection really mean for the average Guyanese consumer, the business community, and the broader economy? Then there's a Kaito News article claiming Hess's lifting cost is just US $7 per barrel. But hold on, does this mean the entire Stabroek block operating cost is just $7 US? If you're nodding yes, you've already fallen into the misinformation trap. Let's dig into what the numbers actually refer to and why these half-truths, whether intentional or not, distort the national conversation on oil. And speaking of distortion, let's talk about the Alfred Boulai's claim that the Commissioner of Information is stonewalling oil and gas disclosures. The thing is, the information is publicly available. It's on the Ministry of Natural Resources website. So why pretend it's being hidden? Or is this just political theater? Also, we'll dissect the recent Kaito News article about the seventh oil project and its claims that Exxon's study have revealed that it will raise the cost of living. Is that a fair reading of the environmental impact assessment? Or is someone twisting the facts to fuel a particular agenda? Plus, we have something to say about Nigel Hughes' performance this week. passionately criticizing police brutality and calling out systematic failures 10 years too late. Londoners deserve justice in 2012, yes, but what did the AFC do when they were in power from 2015 to 2020? And why should people trust them now when they stayed silent then? All that and more coming up on this episode of Behind the Agenda. Joining me in welcoming on screen, as usual, Joel Bagwedin, who will be taking us through the paces. Joel, good evening. Welcome to the program.
Good evening, Cordell. Good evening to the viewers. Thank you for having me again. It's always a pleasure to be here to unpack these issues.
Great. So, Joel, let's jump right into it. We'll start off with the Bank of Guyana's injection into the Forex market. Now, there has been a lot of chatter surrounding the Bank of Guyana's injection of 135 million into this Forex market, or Guyana's Forex market. Some are calling it alarming. Others say it's normal monetary management. From your vantage point, what's really going on here? Should Guyanese be concerned? And how does this injection compare to past interventions? Is this scale unusual, or is this a reflection of a more active economy?
So it is a reflection of the growing complexity and sophistication of the economy. It is a reflection of the expansive growth in non-oil and in the non-oil sectors as well as the overall economy.
Mhm.
And it is consistent. The injection is consistent with, when you look at a time series of data, it is consistent with in relationship to GDP. So, for example, over the years, I've looked at the foreign exchange intervention by the central bank into the market, and it has accounted for less than or equal to 1% of GDP. Cordelli there?
Right here with you. Go ahead.
Yes. So it is consistent in relative to the size of our GDP. It is a consistent sum in that it accounts for less than or equal to 1% of GDP. Now, when, as you mentioned in your opening statement, that following that injection, there was a slew of letters and commentaries from mainly economists and economists whom I would refer to as elderly economists.
Mm.
And it was drawn to my attention, one particular letter writer who said that the drop in the value of the Guyana dollar is as a result of bad management by the government of the tariff. So that was drawn to my attention. And then, of course, I saw the other related articles by Thomas Singh and Terence Yip, and the commentary by Ramesh Kampat under the Stabrook News commentary section there on their website. So I take note of all of that, and I did a response to it, and I sought to do an empirical analysis to substantiate, as I usually do, substantiate my argument.
Right.
And with respect to the notion that the tariff had anything to do with the drop in the value of the Guyana dollar, I said that, and I've demonstrated that the tariff at this point in time has nothing to do, has no bearing whatsoever at this time on the foreign exchange market and the exchange rate. Because the issue of the tariff is a fluid matter. When the 38% was announced, subsequently, President Trump said, we're putting a pause on that, a 90-day pause. And in the meanwhile, during that pause, the 10% tariff would apply. So the 10% versus a 38% would have vastly different degree of impact.
Right.
So that at this point in time, there's no bearing on the exchange rate. So I had to draw that, I had to explain that and draw that distinction clearly. And now I have the opportunity to do it here on this program.
Right.
And then I went on to explain and demonstrate that our exchange rate has fluctuated within a certain bandwidth. And that bandwidth or band range,
Mm.
when I look at the data from 2014 to present, up to February 2025 data that is available, that band is plus or minus 4%. And so how you calculate the band? The band is calculated based on a central rate. And the central rate that I use is the Bank of Guyana average rate, which is stable at 208.5. So I use that as the central rate to then calculate the market rate by the commercial banks, which is the average mid rate over that period, the fluctuation up and down, plus and minus 4%.
Mm.
Now, the economic theory would tell you that you have different types of exchange rate regime. You have fixed exchange rate regime, you have floating exchange rate, and you have managed float. And I draw reference to an IMF working paper on Guyana that has examined our monetary policy framework and our exchange rate regime. And the author of the paper made the case that considering the oil economy, considering the effects of the oil economy, this new economy driven by oil production and the large inflows of foreign exchange and all the structural changes and reform that are necessitated, not as a result of that, and that are
Mm.
inevitable, that the paper made the case for a more flexible exchange rate regime to be able to manage external volatilities, vulnerabilities, and so on, to be able to withstand external shocks and that type of stuff, you know, in a more resilient manner.
Right.
So when I did the empirical analysis, and from historically how our economy has evolved from pre-oil to now post-oil, I have seen that our exchange rate is now fluctuating within a 4 plus or minus 4% bandwidth or band range.
Mm.
And the IMF would tell you that a 1% band is linked to a fixed exchange rate regime. And given our economy that is so dynamic now, with all the moving parts, that you have to move to a flexible exchange rate regime, right? To manage the externalities, to be able to adequately respond to the externalities. And that flexibility, you got to allow the exchange rate to fluctuate more than 1%. So some countries have far more flexible exchange rate regimes whose exchange rates are fluctuating between 7 to as high as 7 to 12%. We're fluctuating at 4%, which is manageable and which is flexible given the state of our economy. So I've established that by way of empirical analysis.
Mm.
And that is the appropriate and that is appropriate at this time. And I've drawn reference to the IMF paper, which lends validity to that argument, because that paper was written when that paper was written 2 or 3 years ago. Let me see, 3 years ago, that paper was written since in 22. We're now in 25. So at that time when the paper was written, our exchange rate was not as flexible. It was
Mm.
fluctuating,
Right.
but less than 1%. Less than 4%. Under 4%, right? So I've established all of that by way of empiricism, by way of analysis.
Mm.
So then I made mention of our net foreign exchange reserve, which is over 4 billion.
Mm.
And I explain what that comprises. That comprises the natural resource fund balance, the central bank net foreign assets, as well as the commercial banks. Right?
Right.
So from those indicators, evidently, we do not have a macroeconomic fundamental issue with respect to foreign exchange, right? That there's no issue. So I saw now under my letter by that was published by Starbuck News. Under the letter, Ramesh Gampat wrote, someone under the letter says that only Gampat could respond to me that he has more authority than maybe Thomas Singh.
Mm.
So Gampat, I'm looking for what Gampat said. Um, so this is what Gampat says. Gampat responded and said that thanks for placing your confidence in me, but I no longer respond to JB, that is me, and his half baked ideas and propaganda. If one looks at my recent book on the Guyanese FX market, the conclusion is that JB does what he always does, defends the PPP regardless of how intelligent he comes over. So that's Gampat. That's what he's talking about me, someone asking him to respond.
Uh,
Now, here's the thing. In the book, he wrote glowingly about me as a bright young man and so on, while he
mm.
sought to discredit my analysis. But here's the true reason why he no longer responds to me. Because I identified the flaws in his analysis that he sought to discredit my analysis,
Mm.
sought to challenge my analysis. And what did he say? His theory is that we're having a foreign exchange shortage because the non-oil trade balance is there is a growing deficit, and therefore non-oil export is stagnated, and that is causing the shortage. Now if you listen to him, if you listen to that in theory, it sounds it sounds good, it sounds
Mm.
correct. But that is one. Remember, hear what he says half baked. He says half baked analysis, and you saw the paper I wrote, right? I
Right.
dealt with multiple variables. I dealt with the reserve, I dealt with import cover, I dealt with the exchange rate fluctuation, I dealt with a multiplicity of variables that feed into this matter, right? It's not, I didn't just look at the trade balance.
Right.
And so I pointed out that his analysis is flawed because you can't only look at the trade balance. We have other sources of inflows. You have to look at the entire balance of payment account because we have inflows of foreign exchange from foreign direct investment and other sources, LCDS and so on. You have grants, you have external borrowing, you have so many different, you have private capital coming in, inflows, investments.
Right.
You can't just look at a single component of a larger whole, right? Or of a larger framework, which is the balance of payment.
Right.
I pointed that out, and I did an analysis from since 1992. I pulled data of the balance of payment account, and I have shown that even when you don't have, Shivani, come take this call, please. Janet, tell come here. When we were bankrupt, when you bankrupt, that's where the IMF comes in, and you borrow money from the IMF to finance your balance of payment, to finance the deficit. And I've shown that historically, when we were bankrupt, our debt was written off largely by the debt forgiveness, debt restructuring, and maybe on one or two occasions, we've had a direct intervention of foreign exchange to finance the balance of payment from the IMF. Most of it was debt restructuring and debt forgiveness.
Mm.
Even in that period, right? Even in that period, you only had one or two or three, if I recall correctly. I have the data, but it's not more than three. It wasn't like every year you had an injection from the IMF. It was minimal. Most of it was debt restructuring and debt forgiveness. And of
Mm.
course, the privatization and the restructuring of the economy and the valuation of the exchange rate to make our exports more competitive, etc., and push the private sector and so on, right? So that's how we are able to recover from the state of bankruptcy. And I've demonstrated using data since 1992 to present how the balance of payment would have recorded surplus foreign exchange balances, not deficit. We've been having balance of payment deficits on for many years, and we've also been having a lot of surpluses of recent. So
Mm.
that shows how the balance of payment, our reserve, can finance the foreign exchange or make the intervention without eroding our reserve. In fact, the empirical evidence suggests that our reserve is not eroding, it's increasing.
Mm.
Okay, the empirical evidence is the inverse of that. So that's why he no longer responds to me. And guess what? Starbuck News does not, and they never publishes my rebuttal. And I think when they publish these letters that I write, these with hardcore analysis, I think they call around these people, are you going to respond to this? And then they publish. And then somebody responds. But when I rebut now, like right now, I'm in the process of writing a response to Terence Yip.
Mm.
And I bet you I did one to Christopher Ram. They never published the rebuttal. They never published my rebuttal that I'm talking about here now to Ramesh Gampat. And I'm going to read for you what I've started writing in response to Terence Yip. So moving on, so I've spoken about Thomas Singh, Ramesh Gampat, now Terence Yip. Today, he writes in the Starbuck News, and this is what he writes. He says, Joel Bhagwandin's nothing unusual about Bank of Guyana's US 135 million injection into the forex market. A thesis of 1,172 words, one large table with 56 data points. To boot, two diagrams concludes with a rather trite conclusion, which is not even the key issue. Now, that's his opening paragraph, and he went on to make this case about real exchange rate and so on, right? And then I saw Thomas Singh at the bottom of that comments. And this is what Thomas Singh writes. Terence, were we to look at our history as a country and as a world, we'd see that a leader is as effective as those who parrot and practice what that leader says and even thinks. In this case, we can only hope that the parrots, instead of erecting straw men for dismantling, take some time to learn the nuances of the real exchange rate. Because I'm not a macroeconomist, I freely concede that it is not the easiest thing to understand. But as you point out again in this letter, it is all important in our context. There is a belief in the wider Caribbean that Guyana can provide other countries in the. So I'm going to stop there. I'm just going to read the first part. He wrote three paragraphs. I'm going to deal with it here now. So I started writing the response to Terence Hipp. So allow me to read what I've written so far, and then I will, when I finish reading that, I will then elaborate on my response to what I just read there from Thomas Singh, and what is my rebuttal to Terence Hipp. So
Right.
let me read what I've drafted here so far to response to Terence. As a perpetual student of economics, I am often utterly disheartened when economists and or economic scholars of sorts fail to utilize applied economics to economic and public policy issues in Guyana's context. Instead, as I observed, they opt to regurgitate textbook conventional theories in their attempts to explain real life pragmatic issues. It is a very unscholarly behavior, hence, emphasis on my expression of disappointment. In this regard, reference is made to Terence Yip's letter in Starbuck News edition of April 16, 2025, titled Look into the Root Causes of the US Shortage. Therein, Yip dedicated the aforesaid essay in response to my contribution on the subject, published in the April 15, 2025 edition of the Starbuck News, titled Nothing Unusual About Bank of Guyana's US 135 million injection into the Forex market. Yip postulates Joel Bagwandin's nothing unusual about Bank of Guyana's 135 million injection into the Forex market. The thesis of 1,172 words, one large table with 56 data points, two diagrams, concludes with a rather trite conclusion, which is not even the key issue. Dr. Yip is certainly correct about my trite conclusion because I was not making a new theoretical or empirical argument. I was simply in response to both him and another economist of sorts, Thomas Singh, two elderly economists' contention that the Bank of Guyana's foreign exchange intervention is not unusual and it is a normal practice in the conduct of its monetary policy function as
Mm.
a gentle reminder. Accordingly, to substantiate my contention, I have demonstrated this fact with irrefutable empirical evidence. Furthermore, it is noteworthy to highlight that the learned and respected economist Dr. Terence Yip did not offer an alternative applied empirical analysis. He did not refute or reject my analysis and the findings thereof, and most of all, he did not refute, challenge, or disagree with my conclusion, although he rejected it, save and except if his rejection therewith is to be deemed an implied disagreement. If so, he would have nonetheless offered a vacuously incredible basis. Yip's proposition that it is the real exchange rate index that matters over the long haul does not add any value based, scholastically solution oriented contribution on the matter. In fact, he forgot to state the rest of the theory, the limitations thereof, and the mechanics of the real exchange rate equation. I would have liked to see his own calculations of the real exchange rate index for Guyana, especially coming from an economist of his caliber. That is what I have so far. Now I'm going to go into dealing with the substance of the real exchange rate. So let me talk about it here now. So the real exchange rate is an adjustment of the nominal exchange rate, taking into account price differentials in two different countries, the trade in two different trading countries, and inflation. So that is what it is about. That is what the real exchange is in theory. It has to do with relative price in relation to another country. In other words, it compares the price for a commodity, let's say, for example, in the United States, and what is the price for that same commodity in Guyana. But here is the problem with that, which he did not mention. All theories have their limitations.
Mm.
He didn't talk about the limitation and he didn't talk about the mechanics, which is what I'm going to deal with. The limitation of the real exchange rate is that the formula does not account for the different cost drivers of a commodity, the different drivers of cost or factors of cost or variables of cost. For example, the cost for a shirt in the United States would not be the same for the same shirt in Guyana if you have importers and distributors in Guyana who are importing the shirt from the US to sell it in
Right.
Guyana.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because that shirt, when it comes to Guyana, it will have to factor in add on top of the price in the US, you would have to add shipping cost to get it to Guyana. You would have to add import duties if applicable. You'd have to add VAT if applicable. You'd have to add transportation costs to get it from the port to your shelf.
Right.
And then you'd have to add markup for you to make a profit. So obviously there will be a variance in the price, but it doesn't tell you anything accurately about whether there is any parity with the exchange rate, the value of the local dollar to the foreign currency. For those factors, the real exchange rate formula doesn't take account for that. And this is what I'm talking about, practicality and applied economics. Here you have these two elderly economists of sorts regurgitating textbook conventional theories, not doing any application of it, any applied analysis, and they're making conclusion about real pragmatic issues in the context of Guyana, and they want us, we must accept that. I can't accept that, and we cannot accept that. Do the analysis, run the model, run the calculation, show me your analysis, show me alternative empirical argument and evidence to support your conclusion. So that's the first point with respect to his argument that I'm going to get into. The second point is that in order for you to influence your real exchange rate, because this is the thrust of their argument, that it is the real exchange rate that matters, you can only influence the real exchange rate by influencing your nominal rate, because that's the relationship. Your nominal rate is directly related to your real exchange rate. So changes in your nominal exchange rate will affect your real exchange rate in theory and in practice. So if you go on Google now or AI, or you pick up any economics textbook, it will tell you that in order for you to effectively deploy the real exchange rate as a tool to manage price stability or exchange rate stability, or to achieve your exchange rate stability goals, it will tell you that one, you have to have a flexible exchange rate regime with respect to your nominal exchange rate. And I've already established that. We have a relatively flexible exchange rate regime whereby the exchange rate is allowed to fluctuate within a band range of plus or minus 4%. As long as your exchange rate is fluctuating within a band that is greater than 1%, that is what characterizes a flexible exchange rate regime. So that is one of the first conditionalities you have to have. If you're fluctuating, if your exchange rate is fluctuating in a band that is 1% or less, then that is not a flexible exchange rate. So the first condition to be able to effect your real exchange rate is by firstly having a flexible or moving to a flexible exchange rate regime. And the evidence shows clearly that we are fluctuating in a band of plus or minus 4%. So that's flexible. The second condition is that potentially you may have to impose what you call capital control. Now, our market as it is does not warrant capital control because we are an open economy and we promote free capital flows. If you impose capital controls, it will cause problems. It will cause problems because the first thing, for example, foreign investors want to know when they invest money here is that they must be able to freely repatriate their profit. If we impose capital control, that is going to be a deter. That's going to be a barrier to foreign direct investment. So we do not have capital controls, and The current economic conditions does not warrant it. The only time there is a need for capital control is if you're having economic problems, is if you're having your foreign exchange reserve is eroding, you're having a sovereign debt problem, you're having a lack of confidence in the economy, and you're doing really, really bad in your economic performance and you're depleting your reserves, well then you would want to impose some elements of control to prevent capital flight because that would cause your economy to collapse. We are not at that stage, so there is no need for capital control, but we have one of the conditions, which is a flexible exchange um, rate regime. The
Right.
third is the one of the main purpose of using the real exchange rate to manage monetary policy is to really understand the country's international competitiveness and how it is performing in terms of international trade, the extent to which you have deficits and the impact of those deficits, which is something the US is trying to do now that they're imposing all these tariffs, right? How those deficits would impact your economy, impact your exchange rate, and so on, right? So, and we are doing exactly that on the structural side of things, in terms of structural reforms to the economy to make it to become more competitive. We are doing a series of things. We are investing in the economy, in agriculture. We're investing in the gas to energy to bring down energy cost. We've instituted a range of subsidies policy, fiscal policy, the removal of VAT on a range of items, the waiver of the excise tax from the fuel import. All of those measures, including the investments in the economy, aim geared towards developing a diversified economy and a more competitive economy. Those are the conditions and preconditions with which one you can the central bank can effectively use the real exchange rate as a tool to manage price stability. So in other words, what they're talking about, oh, you got to focus on real exchange rate, it's all nonsense. It's nonsense because those conditions exist.
Right.
It's a difficult thing if you're going to say, okay, this is our real exchange rate. It is a difficult calculation to do because how are you getting the data? You got to get the data for the US, the price for commodities in the US, and well, we have the data for our. It's a difficult thing to calculate. That's why he can't calculate it because the calculation in itself is not difficult. It's a simple mathematical equation. But
Mm.
where you getting the data from? So that is not important. That is not important. You in nonetheless you nonetheless would affect the real exchange rate by managing the nominal exchange rate and through those conditions that I've explained.
Mm.
So
Mm.
this is what we're dealing with these elderly economists, just lifting things out of the textbook and using that to explain real issues rather than applying it to do the analysis and tell us what's the solution or give
Yeah.
us your solution.
Yeah. Now, I want to turn your attention to some misinformation of in relation to Hess's lifting costs. Now, Kaicho News reported that Hess's lifting cost is just $7 per barrel, and many took that to mean that the entire Stabroek block has an operating cost of $7. Can you help us clear this up? What exactly does lifting cost refer to, and is this $7 number being misinterpreted?
Yeah, so when I read the story, it was accurate in the sense that that is Hess's cost, the $7. But the way the story was framed is misleading. The $7 is accurate, but the way the story was framed was misleading for the reader because for a reader who may not be plugged into the sector and what is happening in the sector and the financial analyses and so on, they would interpret that to mean that $7 is the cost for the entire, which would mean that this thing is extremely lucrative. We should be getting more money. The profit oil that we collect should be way far more greater than what we're collecting now. So that is what I want to address, that the article did not address, right?
Mm.
So remember, the Stabrook block operator comprises a consortium of companies. That consortium include Exxon, who is the operator, Hess, and CNOOC.
Mm.
Exxon has, I think, 45%. Hess between Hess and CNOOC, they have the remainder. So when you look at the cost that you're talking about is more or less your average cost or break-even cost or your production cost. So when you look at cost, you will have to divide it in relative to based on how much shares each one of them have,
Okay. Okay.
right? So you have to divide. So the actual cost for the entire per barrel for that entire Stabrook block is about $21. Based on 2023 financials, it's about 21.6 US dollars per barrel.
Mm. Mm.
So if you divide, let's say $21. If you divide, let's divide it evenly by three. That's how you get 7 3 is 21. So that's how they get $7.
Mm.
Right? So that's their share, but it's not the total cost. That's
Oh,
their share, which is just a percentage of the total cost for the entire block. So that clarification I felt was important because people could think, oh, well, if it's $7, then how come we only collecting so much in profit? We should be collecting way more in profit,
right, right, right.
right? But that's not the case. So that is what I wanted to clarify.
Right. No, I want to draw your attention to Alfred Bulai's clear claim on lack of transparency. Now, Bulai and others are suggesting that vital oil and gas information is being hidden, and that the Commissioner of Information has failed to release key documents. But you have said that this info is publicly available. Can you clarify
Could
what's already out there and where it can be accessed? And why
so
do you think some voices continue to push this narrative of secrecy when the data is online and accessible?
can you pull up on your screen the Ministry of Natural Resources website?
Yeah, just give me a second.
I don't just want to tell you, I want to show the world where to find it.
Sure.
So me telling you or showing you. And me telling you what the textbook said. I'm doing the analysis. I'm applying it.
Hold on a second, it's loading. Oh boy.
So you're on the website here, right?
Yeah.
Now you see that tab that says Media Center? Click on
Right.
the Media Center tab. Look, you see there's a oil production data there.
Right.
Go on the oil production data. There you go. So he's saying that he went to the information access to information commissioner and he can't get his information, the oil production data. And there is the production data. There
But
is
this year updated up to February 28th, 2025. This is recent.
exactly.
Wow. Imagine that.
So that's
So
not all. There is more data. There is more data. Let me locate it first, and then I'll tell you where to go.
So, but they have categories here: gas injected, used, flared,
Right,
gas
right,
production, oil
right. It
prices,
has
cost
all the
injection.
chemical composition and all that.
Wow. So again, I'm asking, why do you think people are pretending that this information is not out here?
There is a let me send this. There's more rich data. I'm sending this to you on WhatsApp. It's easier for me to send you the link. Now pull up that link that I just sent you there. I could put it in the chat too, right?
Yes.
Make it easier for you to get it here.
No, I got it. I got it here. Just give me a second.
Yeah. So you see now look at your right. You see you could download a document.
Right here.
Click on view document. Click on view document. Just view. Now you see this information. This is what Alfred Bulai is talking about. There's two components, right?
Mm,
What he is talking about is the production data and the chemical composition, how much sulfur and all them other chemical factors, the makeup of it, right? So
mm,
this report it speaks to that for each field. So you would get a report like this for our crude for LISA 1, LISA 2, and all the different fields, right?
right.
And you see where it is? It's on the internet. You pull it up. So that is one aspect of it, of the data which he seeks. The other aspect of it is how much crude oil we producing. Now everybody know how much crude oil we producing, and that is all over the place. Budget estimates, it's in there. It's in the
Right.
natural resource fund. How much we know we producing 600,000 barrels a day. It is reported in the budget estimates and the budget speech, and it's in your natural resource fund report, and all of that is on the internet. So what is he talking about?
I was asking you, I didn't know.
So
Probably
these guys,
somebody
they
need to
just want some
point him in
attention,
this direction.
or they have some agenda to say that, listen, we've been saying that there is a lack of transparency, so we're going to ignore the fact that this information is available, and we're going to make a whole scene and make a big spectacle about it, and show the world that we have a big problem in this country with transparency.
Yeah.
They just got go on the internet. That's all they gotta do.
I said this morning on my show that it's so upsetting. It's not like they have a lot of work to do. The information is there, but some people just lazy, or they're trying to push their own narrative. Now, let me bring your attention to the environmental impact assessment for the seventh oil project. There's a headline by Kaito News claiming that the seventh oil project will raise the cost of living in Guyana, allegedly based on Exxon's own EIP. Now, Joel, have you reviewed this assessment, and is this a fair or accurate conclusion? And from an economic standpoint, what should we really be taking away from the EIA? And is there any credible link between oil production and higher costs of living in the local context?
So I was taken aback when I read that story. And I said, first, anything from Kaichu News, you got to take it with a grain of salt. So I said, let me go to the report and see what really this report says. Because I found it strange. Reading Kaichu News, I found that quite strange. So when I went to the report, which is the authoritative source, not a second-hand information or third-hand information, which is on the EPA website, by the way. You can go as I speak on the EPA website and pull off that document there. It's the first document for EPA. The EIA assessment is the most recent one.
No.
So the environmental impact assessment includes a component for socio-economic assessment, socio-economic conditions. And so on 3.1.13 of that document, it speaks to the socio-economic conditions, employment, and livelihoods. And this is what the report says. I'm reading an excerpt, the appropriate excerpt here. The project's potential for adverse impacts on socio-economic conditions, employment, and livelihoods include a potential increased cost of living. A potential increased cost, or they may say definitively, they may conclude that it could lead, they say a
Yeah.
potential. Potential means it can happen or it won't happen. Most times it don't happen. Most times potential is a fallacy. It don't ever happen. You have the potential to earn 100 times more. You might
Right.
never earn 100 times more.
Right.
You have the potential to marry the most beautiful woman in the world. You might never marry the most beautiful woman in the
Exactly.
world,
I get you. I get you.
right? So
Mm.
potential is aspirational. It's a fallacy. It's not reality. Um, so let me continue reading. The project's potential for adverse impacts on socio-economic conditions. Oh, by the way, to Glenlal, you have the
I
potential
was
to
going
be
to say that to you, but I said, don't let me interrupt you. I swear, Joel, I swear to God,
you
I
have
was
the
going to say that. But I said, don't let me interrupt this man. Let me continue me do it.
you have the you have the potential to be the next opposition leader, or the potential to be the next president. Well, president of what? President of
Oh my
the
God.
Coconut Oil Association and the toilet paper factory.
I was literally in my mind. I said, don't let me interrupt this man. Go ahead, Joel.
So let's continue. Let's continue. The project's potential for adverse impacts on socio-economic conditions, employment, and livelihoods
Ah,
include a potential increased cost of living in the Georgetown area, although this impact is expected to be negligible. And negligible here is highlighted in bold. Negligible for emphasis. You're saying that there's a potential, but it is negligible, meaning even if it happens, it won't make a difference. Negligible. For
right.
it will be negligible for most residents. There could be a minor impact, a minor impact on lower income households. That's what the report says.
Yeah. Kai, shouldn't you neglected
Negligible,
to mention all of that?
potentially. Here what the report says. Let me paraphrase the report now. It says, in relation to the socio-economic conditions on the effects on cost of living, the project has the potential to impact increased costs of living, but it will be negligible. If that potential is realized, then that potentiality will be negligible for most residents, and for low income, that potentiality will be minor.
Mm, mm.
That's what the report says. You see, okay, John, you say no. The report says that this project will cause they conclude, increased cost of living.
They're neglecting to mention all the information.
They've neglected to mention negligible. How negligible it will be if it does potentially happen.
Joel, we got about 6 minutes left. I want to throw a wild card at you. Now, if you had to debunk one of the most persistent myths being circulated on social media about Guyana's oil sector right now, what would it be and what's the truth?
Do you have
If you had to debunk one of the most persistent myths about the oil and gas sector that's circulating on social media now,
what would
what
it
would
be?
it be and what would be the truth to that myth?
I think we spend 50% of this program, debunking all some of the myth. One had to do with the cost. Oh, that this cost is so low, therefore, implicitly our profit should be maybe 4 times more. When the cost is just a fraction of the cost, that is their share of the cost. So that's one. Two, we talk about the impact assessment, the impact on how the oil and gas sector will impact cost of living. The question is, the government is managing the economy well within this framework and all, taking into account all the complexities, all the challenges. The government is managing it well. Look at our inflation rate when compared to the rest of the world and the region. Look at our GDP growth when compared to the rest of the world and region. Look at how much our spending power has increased. We spoke about it in a previous program. $1.4 trillion, that is almost equivalent to the size of our budget, 25% of GDP from 8% of our GDP. Are people earning more money and spending more in the economy?
Yeah, yeah. I
So
want
there's a lot of myths, a lot of myths.
Yeah, I want to ask you, what are your thoughts on this situation that happened in Linden? I've noticed quite a few political figures running up there, speaking about justice and a bunch of stuff. More so, the leaders of the AFC. They would have been the last administration. There were reports in relation to a 2012 incident that took place. They literally did nothing to implement any kind of reform with the police. What's your take on what we've been hearing from the leaders of the AFC in relation to this situation, and what I deem as dredging up all emotions to get a reaction out of the Lindeners?
It's nothing new. What we're witnessing with the AFC leaders is a demonstration of their profound ineptness, their profound lack of capacity to truly govern a country, to truly manage a country. All they're hanging on to is rhetoric, false rhetoric, nothing credible, and they do nothing about it. When they have the opportunity, when they had the opportunity, they, as you've correctly pointed out, they've done nothing about it. In fact, when they got the opportunity to do all the great things they talk about, sharing the corn, sharing the sardines, sharing the coconut oil, sharing everything, what did they do? They signed contracts to themselves, they paid themselves, they wreaked havoc in the economy, destroyed the fabric of our traditional sectors. They put people on the breadline, thousands of people. And when you juxtaposition that reality with respect to their performance to the reality that is increasingly becoming visible to all and sundry, I'm speaking about when the president, the vice president goes out into the communities, we see how former APNU AFC supporters are coming in droves, are endorsing the president, endorsing the government, endorsing the PPPY, because then people not got time. Race not gonna put food on the table.
Yeah,
Racism
exactly.
won't put food on the table. Rhetorics won't put food on the table. And progress and prosperity and the opportunities for them to elevate their lives, their livelihoods, their standard of living, their quality of life, provide a better future for their children and their grandchildren. They're seeing that clearly. And I think it was a good thing that the PPP was out of power for 5 years and gave them an opportunity so that this generation of people would
Yeah,
have direct experience,
the other
live and
side.
direct experience to see what it is like to live under the APNU AFC and what it is like, you know.
Yeah, yeah. Joe, thank you for being on the program with us this evening. That's all the time we have for the show today. Remember to join us next week, Wednesday. Just on a note, I think we have two more Wednesdays. There's for Article 29 or 69. I think it's 29 with the Ministry of Education. So this program has been moved back 1 hour. So when you're looking at it next week, and to those persons who look for the program at 7:30, it's starting at 8 and we'll restart at 7:30 once this programming with Minister Manik Chan has wrapped up. Thank you for joining us on the program. Again, Joel, thank you for being here, and we'll be here again next week with more plans, policies, and progress, taking you behind the agenda. Take care and good night.
We're breaking down the policies with truth as our guide. With clarity on the mic, bringing light to the fight. Together we're ready, shining bright. Behind the agenda, plans in our hands. Exploring the progress where every voice stands. From the ground impact to the oil and gas scene. Together we'll build a future strong and keen. We'll dive into the data, the numbers don't lie.